Good afternoon to our friends on the East Coast, and good morning to you on the West Coast. Thank you for joining us today for the webinar, Nonprofit Investing 101, Private Equity, Hedge Funds, and Other Alternative Investments, presented by Baker Hostetler. As the financial markets enter a new phase of higher interest rates, volatility, and inflation, now is a great time to look into alternative investments. My name is Alexander Reed, and I'm the leader of Baker Hostetler's tax-exempt organizations and charitable giving team. Today, I am joined by Adam Gale, leader of the investment funds industry team and partner in the New York office, Betsy Smith, a tax partner in the New York office, and Matt Elkin, tax-exempt organizations and charitable partner in the Washington, D.C. office. Before we get started, there are a few housekeeping items we'd like to bring to your attention. This presentation will last approximately 1 hour and is approved for 1 hour of CLE credit in California, Colorado, Florida, Georgia, New Jersey, New York, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Texas, and the state of Washington. Credit is pending in Illinois and Virginia. Other states may be available upon request. Please note that the following if you are applying for CLE credit. There will be 2 separate codes that will appear on the slide deck during the program. Please write down these codes. At the end of the webinar, a survey will appear. Please be sure to answer all of the questions and include your bar number and state. If you have any questions during the presentation, please click on the Q&A button and type your question. We will try our best to answer them at the end of the program, time permitting. If not, we will follow up with you after the webinar to answer your question. A recording of the webinar slides and presenter contact information will be provided in a follow-up email. Now let's turn to the agenda. We're going to be talking today about fiduciary duties, governance structures, investment process, investment terms, tax issues, including the unrelated business income tax, or UBIT as we fondly know it, tax issues for private foundations, and cryptocurrency, because nothing is complete without a touch of crypto these days. Thanks so much for your attention, and now I'll turn it over to my esteemed panelists.
Welcome and good afternoon. We'll go to the first slide to talk about fiduciary duties. I have a lot to cover, so I will go quickly through what is sometimes a common topic, but really focus on practical ways to address fiduciary duties in the alternative investment context. I think a good framework for either thinking about your own fiduciary duties, if you are a fiduciary, or advising them or working with them, is that they help you address things that you can control and to prepare for things that you cannot control. And I'll illustrate that as we go along. But it's really important to understand that satisfying your duties doesn't mean you have to weather circumstances in the general investment environment. The fiduciary duties that are applicable to alternative investments for nonprofit come from 2 primary sources. On this slide are the 2 traditional corporate duties of care and loyalty. Some of the details of the duty of care, which probably is most implicated in alternative investments, is the general duty to be careful and prudent. And what that means practically is engage in due diligence on investments. And that especially is an important one because that has seen changes over the years. The standards for due diligence on investments has changed. And one way to satisfy the duty of care is making sure that somebody somewhere in the investment process is doing due diligence on investment funds. Another way to satisfy your duty to be careful is to keep good records, including making sure that you receive reports from whoever is doing the actual execution on the deals, whether it's employees or external managers, that they are giving you good information and you're receiving the reports and that you're acting on them. And sometimes it might mean that you check the usefulness of the reports. Is the right information coming from the reports, and whether it's specific individual managers or if there's somebody doing a more global portfolio-wide report, to make sure that those reports are useful to you. The duty of loyalty is usually best satisfied for nonprofits in this context by making sure to apply the conflict of interest policy to potential investment transactions. Most typically, this means the nonprofit may be making an investment in a fund where one of the other fiduciaries is also connected to that, maybe also an investor, maybe even a sponsor is a common thing. In addition to these corporate duties, another source of fiduciary duties applicable to alternative investments are the UPMIFA duties on the next slide, which in many cases are more specific information, more specific details on some related concepts. The UPMIFA duties add some duties that usually aren't going to be too specifically relevant in the alternative investment context, although sometimes they are, to consider the donor intent and the overall nonprofit purposes and general good faith and prudence. But especially there are some UPMIFA duties which are particularly appropriate to consider with alternative investments. A big one is to minimize costs. And related to due diligence and making an informed decision, you have to not only just generally minimize costs, but also make yourself informed as to what those costs are. And in conjunction with an additional related duty to investigate and verify relevant facts, part of the due diligence process to really uncover all the details about potential alternative investment. One area of UPMIFA duties that received some controversy when it was being proposed was the extent to which members of a fiduciary body, whether it's a board or investment committee or a chief investment officer, has to use the skills or expertise in managing and investing. So this is a duty in UPMIFA in nearly all states that have adopted this, which I think is all but one. What that means, for instance, in the lawyer context, is that lawyers do not have to provide legal advice and other people do not have to actually do their job if they're serving on the investment committee, but they are expected to spot issues that are relevant to their skills and expertise. And so that can have an extra duty on people who have specific skills and expertise. But it also means when we're considering the composition of the governing investment fiduciary body, whether it's the board or the investment committee, to make sure that people who have those skills and expertise are there, are on the body and using those skills. Another important duty is a duty to diversify unless there's a good reason not to. This duty actually is sometimes can be thought of as motivating a need to look into alternative investments. Most traditional mutual fund investments just give exposure to the traditional public debt and equity markets, and another part of the investment universe is can't be captured there and has to be captured in alternative investments. And so a true broad diversification would start to use portfolios above a certain size to give exposure to alternative investments. But this also means that you have to regularly consider the asset allocation and make sure that you aren't having concentrated positions, which can sometimes be difficult to manage with alternative investments, as they can be very lumpy in both their investments and the dispositions. And finally, an important UPMIFA duty is to dispose of unsuitable assets, and that includes rebalancing, which can also change once you add alternative investments to a portfolio. That following an asset allocation is a strong duty for UPMIFA. Some additional factors in UPMIFA on the next slide are to consider a range of special factors. We're going to focus later on in detail on considering tax consequences of a factor, and some of the other ones to consider the spending needs of the organization and how alternative investments fit into the overall portfolio are somewhat self-explanatory. The first one to consider factors such as economy, economic conditions is what it actually says, and inflation is sometimes misleading. Sometimes people take that to mean that in considering the investments, you should consider whether the economy is doing well or poorly, or whether inflation is on the rise or it's going down. And sometimes people interpret that to mean that they should be engaging in market timing. I think the commentary to UPMIFA and people who advise nonprofits and portfolio investors explain that what that really means is to consider that you pick an asset allocation which can weather various economic conditions, regardless of what they are, and also various inflationary conditions, regardless of what they are. And you can't really control the general economy or what inflation does, and nobody has a crystal ball, but it's important to consider the range of factors that can come in. Now, another way to consider the economy and inflation, though, is related to the spending needs. So if it's looking like the needs of the organization are increasing or the other resources of the organization are decreasing, that's an economic condition that may lead to more specific actions, usually on the spending side, though, and not on the longer term asset allocation. So far, none of these UPMIFA duties are really unique to alternative investments. But on the next slide, we notice that the UPMIFA did contemplate specific alternative investments. It makes a reference to pooling funds, and that also that nonprofits that make investments in the pooled funds may generate UBTI, and that should be considered. But UPMIFA didn't create any other specific duties that are specific to alternative investments. And so really on the next slide, we'll go into just some of the governance documentation that can be helpful to satisfy those requirements. So listed on the next two slides are some of the key documents that a nonprofit, and usually its investment committee, would use as their Bible that will guide them. Most importantly, starting with the investment policy statement, is an asset allocation. And sometimes that's called a strategic asset allocation, with the word strategic in there to remind people that it's a long-term asset allocation and that you generally don't change it due to the blowing winds of the economy and what direction they're going in. But it's just a longer-term asset allocation. And an important element of that that Adam will get to a little bit later is that alternative investments usually should not be thought of as an asset class. They are really kind of a investment structure, but the underlying investments could themselves be very different asset classes. Even almost especially with hedge funds, they could be a variety of different types of assets. So an asset allocation that is really tailored to what kind of alternative investments the nonprofit is considering should be important. The operating guidelines part of an IPS, sometimes an appendix to the IPS, sometimes maybe its own separate document, is important because there's a lot of procedural things that just have to be done with alternative investments. You have to keep track of notices that you have to give or reports that you have to get, and how the different investment memos to propose additional investments are done. That usually needs to be tailored to investing in alternative investments in the operating guidelines. The investment committee charter, it's important that the right people in the whole organization have skills and expertise, and that they know exactly what they're doing. Somewhere in the document, there should be, often it's in the committee charter, which can specifically say what the investment committee does, should outline who's doing what. Another item is on the calendar, who is doing what and when it should be expected. Often there can be a whole calendar that says certain things have to be done every month or every quarter when the investment committee meets, or when things come in. And to keep things organized, that can be really helpful. And having all these documents outline all the steps and the procedures so that people can follow their fiduciary duties. It's important to show that they satisfied their fiduciary duties but it's also important to document that they did it. The next slide continues this list with an important specification of often when there's lots of different parties involved, consultants and external managers and some in-house people and some out-house people, external people, it's important to document where the various decisions are being made. Sometimes different parties need notice. Sometimes the board or the investment committee wants to approve investments over a certain size or in a certain area. And I've seen, it's very much tailored to the organization and the people and sort of the history of the organization, how this works. But it's very important to be crystal clear about it because people operating outside of expectations can often be a problem. The spending policy is something that needs to be adjusted occasionally to deal with the illiquidity of alternative investments. The written engagement with all of the people, internal investment folks and external managers should be clearly documented, and any other kind of additional checklists should be part of this. And one of the key things that ties everything together are the minutes of the investment committee, which will often contain a strong record of the types of actions that the investment committee took. So after that review of the governance documentation, Adam will start with we'll discuss the general alternative investment landscape and then also some of the specific investment terms and documentation details.
Thanks, Matt. As Alex noted, I am the head of Baker Hostetler's Investment Funds Group. I represent numerous nonprofits, foundations, university endowments in their investments into various types of funds and alternative investments. And I also represent fund sponsors and fund managers in their formation and negotiation of funds. So I do get to see both sides of this and have a very good sense of what is market from negotiating for both limited partners and the general partner and fund sponsor. So to start off, be helpful to just give a little lay of the land as to what we're talking about in terms of alternative investments. And it's easiest to view the world of alternative investments as into closed-end funds and open-end funds. There are also other types of funds, but most funds fall into one of these two categories. There are also hybrid funds, but won't be getting into those today. So in closed-end funds or private equity funds, venture capital funds, open-end funds or hedge funds, commodity funds, cryptocurrency funds. Then there are certain types of funds that can be either type, for example, real estate funds, debt funds, also funds of funds. And we'll be getting into what these are more specifically in a minute. And then there are also other types of asset classes or assets, including cryptocurrencies. And as Matt noted, each of these types of funds can invest in various assets themselves. So let's go to the next slide. So let's talk about what exactly is an open-end fund. So an open-end fund has no specified term. So in other words, the end of the fund is open. The investors contribute all of their capital upon investing in the fund. Typically, there are no distributions to investors while they remain in the fund. And instead, investors need to withdraw or redeem from the fund, either fully or partially, in order to get any liquidity. That's in a typical open-end fund. There are exceptions. Some funds do give some distributions on an ongoing basis. Investors typically can withdraw from the fund quarterly, often after an initial lockup period of 1 year. The fund sponsor gets an incentive allocation, sometimes called a performance fee, which has typically been 20% of the profits, which is determined annually. And that's based on the fund's net asset value. So it's both realized and unrealized gains. And it's above a high watermark, which is the last net asset value or NAV at which the last time an incentive allocation was paid. And we'll be revisiting some of these terms in a few minutes. And then the fund manager gets an investment management fee, which historically has been 2% annually. It's usually paid quarterly, and that's also based on the net asset value. Let's go to the next slide. Let's talk about closed-end funds in contrast. Again, these are normally private equity funds, venture capital funds, some real estate funds. So closed-end funds usually have a specified term. It's often stated to be 7 to 10 years. They're often extensions, so it can go out for much longer than that. So the end of the fund is closed. Each investor has a capital commitment amount, which is the amount that can be called by the fund over time, but the fund can't call any more than that capital commitment amount. And the fund calls the capital when it identifies investments, can also call it for expenses and reserves. Usually the fund has about 3 to 5 years to identify investments, which is called the investment period, after which the fund can only call capital for expenses, also what are called follow-on investments in portfolio companies it's already invested in. When the fund disposes of investment, it normally distributes the proceeds. Sometimes it can recycle them. Investors have no rights to withdraw at all from a closed-end fund and can only transfer their interest in the fund, usually with the consent of the fund's general partner. The fund's general partner or sponsor gets usually what's called a carried interest, which typically is 20% of the profits for each investment, pursuant to a distribution waterfall. So that waterfall typically works this way, which is the investors get their capital contributions back first. Then for a private equity fund, they get a preferred return, often 8%. And then the remaining amounts are split, usually 80% to investors and 20% to the fund's sponsor or general partner. The fund manager also gets a management fee, which historically has been 2% annually. And that's based on capital commitments during the investment period. And then after that, it's normally based on the invested capital amount. Let's go to the next slide. So just very briefly, these are typical investment strategies of each type of fund. I won't spend too much time here. And one thing to note is certainly funds, despite being in a particular type of fund, might make investments in various different things. But just to give you a sense, private equity funds normally make longer term investments in a limited number of companies that are already profitable. They're usually privately held. So each investment is expected itself to be profitable when it's sold. In contrast, venture capital funds, although they make longer term investments as well, it's usually in a larger number of companies that are usually not yet profitable. And the typical venture capital fund historically has actually not expected every investment to be profitable, but instead is kind of banking on that only a handful of the investments will be profitable, but they'll be so profitable that the overall investments will be profitable to investors. And then just hedge funds typically make short-term liquid investments in a larger number of publicly traded companies. Sometimes they hedge against downside risk, is where the name comes from, but certainly a lot of hedge funds don't do any hedging at all. But the name hedge fund is still used to describe them. And then there are also funds of funds, which, as the name implies, invest in other funds. You're paying the fund manager to basically do the due diligence for you on each fund. One downside of fund of funds is you pay a double layer of fees because you're bringing it both to the fund of funds and the underlying funds. But it can be a way to invest into underlying funds that otherwise might not be available to you as an investor. So perhaps you don't have enough to invest in or for other reasons. Let's go to the next slide. So a few notes on hedge funds and open-end funds on timing issues. You can usually make contributions to hedge funds relatively quickly. They usually let investors in on a quarterly basis, sometimes even on a monthly basis. Usually you don't really need to give even so much notice. Getting your money out is harder. We'll discuss this also shortly, but you usually have to give 30, sometimes up to 90 days notice that you want to get out. You can only redeem out usually on a quarterly basis. Sometimes it might even be on an annual basis. There's often a lockup period, which I mentioned, which sometimes can be, even as long as several years. And even once you redeem out of the fund, there's usually a holdback of a small amount of your redemption amount, usually 5 to 10%, which isn't returned until the fund conducts its audit, which is usually usually sometime in the next year. Next slide, please. Private equity funds on timing, the overall term is often 10 to 15 years overall. Sometimes there are extensions, so you have to be prepared not to get your capital back for a long period. Same is true for a venture capital fund. So you also, as I mentioned, capital is called over time, so you need to have the liquidity ready to contribute the capital. And there can also be challenges to stay within narrow asset allocation policy guidelines that you might need to follow. Next slide. So in the investment process, this is a typical process. There could be different ways of going about it, but if you have an outside investment manager, they might recommend an investment, such as a fund. Then the investment committee would conduct a review. The investment committee makes an investment determination. If the determination is to invest, then there's often a legal review, and that's often by outside counsel with specific expertise in reviewing the specific kinds of funds, because as we'll get to, there are a lot of very specific issues to look out for. Then depending on how much negotiating leverage you have for the specific fund, you can try to negotiate the fund's terms, which an outside counsel would often do for you. Also, if you can, you definitely want to be able to negotiate a side letter. Talk about that in more detail in a little bit. Often there'll be different funds that are all as part of the same fund family. So there'll be parallel funds, and often which fund you pick will be dependent on tax issues, which Betsy will talk about a little later. Sometimes there are different share classes, and you might want to decide which one is best. And you also need to complete subscription documents, and sometimes you might need outside counsel's assistance in answering some of those questions. Next slide. So for open-end funds, such as hedge funds, on economic points, on the incentive allocation, there, as I mentioned before, there's a high watermark. Now, this should be done so that the funds, that the high watermark is based on the last time the fund received an incentive allocation, but sometimes funds do have unusual off-market provisions where if you're not careful, it could mean that you end up basically paying twice on kind of the same dollars without receiving any benefit. So that's certainly one thing we look at very carefully, is how that high watermark is defined. So we're still on the slide after legal review on open-end funds economic points. So on management fees, and then some funds peg their incentive allocation to performance against the benchmark, which can have various issues associated with that. So something else to be careful of. And as I said before, traditionally the incentive allocation percentage is usually 20%. Sometimes though, funds might offer different percentages in exchange for longer lockup periods. The management fees traditionally been 2%, but certainly if you're investing into a fund with a lot of assets under management, if it's $1 billion or more, then certainly investors argue that's just windfall for the fund manager. And the purpose of the management fee traditionally was just to cover the manager's overhead. And so you might want to try to negotiate down that 2%. Let's go to the next slide. One of the most important things about an open-end fund such as a hedge fund is your ability to redeem out of the fund. And so I won't talk about all these points right now, but one important point is that every fund has a provision that it can suspend redemptions, which means no one can get out no matter what. And that is a usual provision, but sometimes this provision is written very broadly, might allow the fund manager to suspend for no reason whatsoever. So we usually try to negotiate that point when representing investors. Sometimes there's a gate that's a gate provision, which basically says that if more than a specified percentage of the fund's assets, it's often 25%, try to withdraw at the same time, then the fund can impose a gate and not allow more than that percentage out. So sometimes you might want to try to negotiate that percentage. Sometimes there's a side pocket provision, which basically says that if the fund ends up investing in some investments that become illiquid, they can put it in a separate account or even a separate entity. It's off to the side, and when the investor wants to redeem out, they will not actually be able to redeem out of the side pocket. Often you want to get a cap on how much of the fund can be in the side pocket. Let's go to the next slide. So just do this very quickly, not delve into these too much on some other points. Valuation, though, is definitely a big point for open-end funds. especially if they're investing in other than liquid publicly traded securities. And you want to make sure you know how the fund is determining the valuation of those assets, because that is vital to determining the management fee as well as the incentive allocation. You have to note also that there's risks about if other investors might have better rights than you do to get out of the fund, or maybe have more information. And there's some other points here, but in the interest of time, why don't we move on and talk about closed-end funds briefly. To the next slide. So now we're talking about closed-end funds, which I said are private equity funds, venture capital funds. So on the economic points, one of the key things is the waterfall, how the funds proceeds from a disposition of an investment are distributed. There's American style versus European style waterfalls. So a European style waterfall is when the proceeds are first distributed to investors, so they get all of their capital back first before any carried interest. That percentage of the profits goes to the fund manager. That is called the European style waterfall. Most newer funds have that. More established funds have an American style waterfall, where in fact you just do it on an investment by investment basis, so you only get your capital back for that specific investment, and so the fund manager actually gets carried interest earlier. There's, as I mentioned before, usually a preferred return. Typically it's been 8% for a private equity fund, while venture capital funds typically don't have a preferred return. And so that is something else to look for to make sure there is a preferred return for a private equity fund. And that would get paid out to the investors, again, before the manager or the GP gets its carried interest. Sometimes you'll see funds that charge more than 20% carried interest if the fund has outsized returns. That's something we look at carefully as well. And another really important point to view is the general partner clawback, which is at the end of the fund, the GP has received more carried interest than it should have. On an overall basis, the investors can claw back the excess amount. Let's go to the next slide. Other big economic points is the management fee. Won't go over all of these points, but one of the big points or point that people often overlook is the fact that a fund actually, once it terminates, doesn't actually have to sell off its assets and just dissolve and give everything back to the investors. Instead, it can actually keep going. It can't make any new investments. And if your management fee, though, keeps going as well, in other words, keeps going after the stated term of the fund, some funds have run into what's called a zombie fund problem, where maybe the fund manager has a few investments left that aren't doing well, but it really has no incentive to sell them and give the assets back to the investors because they keep getting their management fee. So that is an issue that we definitely look for and try to negotiate. There's also a lot of negotiation over what are called management fee set-offs, which is if the fund manager or its affiliates is getting various fees from the portfolio companies, such as directors' fees or other types of consulting fees, which investors argue is really a windfall, should be part of the manager's overhead. And so what has happened is it's become market for those types of fees to get set off 100% against management fees, but often there's negotiation on exactly on certain exceptions and other things related to the management fee set off. Let's go to the next slide. So in the interest of time, I'm gonna just go over the next few slides very quickly and then turn it over to Betsy. On governance issues, I'll just highlight the removal of the fund's general partner is vitally important. As an investor, you really want to have the ability to remove the general partner for cause, and there's often a lot of negotiation over that point. There's often a limited partner advisory committee, especially for private equity funds and venture capital funds. As an investor, if you have the inclination and the time, it's great to be on that LPAC. And there are issues surrounding that. Let's go to the next slide. And there's time kind of skip over these other points for closed-end funds, but there are numerous other issues that we look at and negotiate, including what kind of restrictions there are on the investments that the fund can make is vitally important. And that often gets negotiated as well if you have the leverage. Let's go to the next slide. So in our legal reviews, there are various options we offer depending on the investment and what you want to do as an investor, how much you want to negotiate. And they're listed here, but let's go on to the next slide. So just want to spend 1 minute on side letters, which I think are very important and something you really should ask for routinely, no matter in just about every fund you invest in. It's also really useful to ask for an MFN clause, most favored nation, which basically says if any other investor is going to get any better rights than you, that you get offered those same rights. Usually that is limited to investors the same size or smaller than you, but sometimes you can negotiate for that to apply to at least some investors that are larger than you. A lot of investors like to try to get co-investment rights, which potentially can boost your returns. And then often in side letters, you might have some unique requirements that we would put in as well, in addition to tax provisions that would be useful. Let's go to the next slide. Kind of just skip over this, just note if you are the seed or anchor investor, you can get a lot better rights, maybe even a portion of the manager's carried interest. Let's go to the next slide. And we'll turn it over to Betsy, although I think we were supposed to give the code for the CLE credits, but I guess we will get to that in a minute. So I'll turn it over to Betsy and we'll get back to the code later. Thanks.
Thanks, Adam. Hi, everyone. I'm Betsy Smith and I work with all of these three gentlemen, but I'm happy to be here today and talk about the most exciting part of this hour-long webinar. We're going to talk about taxes. I know that's something near and dear to every nonprofit's heart. And I'm going to talk about another colloquial word. We've been using words like clawback, waterfalls, American style, European style, MFN clause, side pockets. So now we're going to talk about blockers and what that means in the context of a tax-exempt investor. So what blockers are typically used to allow for a nonprofit entity to, I see Jeanette is saying, I'm sorry, everyone, the CLE code is number 1. So hopefully everyone has that. So why we typically think about using blockers in the nonprofit
Betsy,
world.
sorry to interrupt. Actually, I think the first code, there are 2 codes. The first code is nonprofit 01, NONPROFIT 01. Sorry, you can go ahead. Sorry to interrupt.
No problem. So we use blockers to enable a nonprofit to go into a fund investment that might generate unrelated business income tax. And a lot of nonprofits that we work with don't want to have any UBIT. They are concerned about that from their constituents, from their nonprofit status. But other funds, other nonprofits that we advise are not as concerned about it. They take it into consideration, but they're willing to go into a fund directly. So as everyone probably knows, passive income that's generated for a nonprofit like interest, dividends, royalties, rents, gains from the sales of security will not generate UBTI. But if you, as a nonprofit, invest in a fund that employs leverage, that investment will generate UBTI. Next slide, please. So the first thing a nonprofit will do when it's considering an alternative investment is make that crucial decision. Do I invest in this fund directly, or do I make an investment through a blocker? Next slide, please. And so what do we mean by a blocker? It's exactly what it says. The blocker can take any of 3 forms. We might form a U.S. corporation, a U.S. LLC that has elected to be treated as a U.S. corporation, or a foreign corporation that is treated for U.S. purposes as a U.S. corporation. And effectively, the income tax consequences of the investments stop at the blocker level. And everything that happens in the fund stops at the blocker level. Therefore, the nonprofit doesn't have any concern about UBTI because everything in terms of income gain or loss, credits, happens all at the corporate level. Next slide, please. You can go to the next slide in the interest of time, UBTI blockers. So another concern that our nonprofits have is after the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, nonprofits can no longer net their UBTI with operating losses. And so that's another reason to consider, do you want to be an investment that's generating UBTI? If you have losses, you're not going to be able to offset them generally. I'm going to jump to the next slide in the interest of time. So what are the concerns that the tax-exempt investor should be thinking about? Well, should they invest through a blocker? That's the first one. We talked about that. If you decide you're going to invest in a blocker, the next question is, where should that blocker be domiciled? Should it be a U.S. Inc., often formed as a Delaware incorporated entity? Should it be in the Cayman Islands? Everyone's used to hearing about blockers in the Cayman Islands, but is the Cayman Islands actually the right place? Or should you consider a treaty jurisdiction where the United States has a treaty? I just remind everyone the United States does not have an income tax treaty with the Cayman Islands. So there's no added benefit to being in the Cayman Islands for purposes of US income tax, but it is very flexible. There's an ease of operating a Cayman Islands blocker. I think that the critical thing here for our nonprofits is to consider that not everything fits for everybody. Every situation is unique. I think a lot of people think Cayman is the way to go, but that may not be the right answer for your particular nonprofit. So it's better to think of it as a tailor-made suit. Next slide, please. And so some of the considerations our nonprofits would think about is how much of the investments are going to generate UBTI. What's the tolerance at the level of the nonprofit for the UBTI? What kind of returns are expected? Are they active returns, passive returns? What is the investment source jurisdiction going to do? For example, if you're investing in US stocks and bonds, the United States has a 30% withholding on those passive investments unless a treaty applies. And we just mentioned that there's no treaty with the Cayman Islands. So that should be a consideration. One of the things we talked about too is if you might want to consider a jurisdiction where the United States does have a treaty. Well, the United States has a wide network of treaties. So perhaps you might look at it forming a blocker in Luxembourg or Germany or Ireland. But you have to then think about what is the income tax rate on the corporate entity blocker in those jurisdictions. That is why a lot of people and fund managers choose to go to the Cayman Islands, because there's no corporate income tax. So there's a lot of competing considerations one should take into account. You have to think about the jurisdiction that you're in. You have to think about the withholding from where the investment returns are coming from. Next slide, please. Another consideration, sort of pick this up in the middle of this slide, is when you decide as a nonprofit to have a blocker to make the investment, the next decision is, in addition to where you should locate it, is who should manage it. Should the nonprofit manage its own blocker, or should you allow the fund manager to set it up and run with it and deal with it? Next slide, please. And let's skip, Jeanette, to 38. So these are just general considerations that often if you have US investments, it's probably better to have a US blocker. As I said, it's not one size fits all, but these are just generally the case. It's better to have a foreign blocker if you have non-US investments. In any case, you should always consider the treaty implications. And you should always, when you're a nonprofit or any other investor in an alternative investment, you should probably model the returns, and you can see more readily where you're going to have tax leakage. Is it in the country of where the blocker is? Is it the country where the source of the income is coming out? Is it withholding? The next slide, please. When you consider a I'm not quite up to takeaways. Back to blockers, fund managed. If a nonprofit wants to consider operating its own blocker, it leaves a lot more of choice to the tax exempt of where to domicile their blocker, but there's an increased compliance and administration that comes along with that. And when you have a managed blocker by the fund manager is typically managing that blocker for a variety of investors. It may be tax exempts, it may be foreign governments, and not every investor in that blocker may have the same goals and objectives. You will typically, as we've talked about, see fund managers talk about having a Cayman blocker. That's what's very well recognized and known in the industry, but it's not always for everybody. And the good news is there's no corporate income tax in Cayman, but the bad news is if you have US investments that are being paid to that Cayman blocker, there's going to be a drag of 30% on the interest and dividends. So the takeaways. You should always evaluate whether you want to have a blocker to make the alternative investment. You want to consider the jurisdiction where the blocker could be located. And then finally, you want to consider, do you want to, you as a nonprofit, take on the management of that blocker, or do you want to cede that to the fund manager and just be a passive investor? Do I have enough time to do? I'll do this quickly, very quickly. There is at least one fund manager, and I wanted to mention this because I thought it was a really interesting idea for nonprofits that wanted to avoid UBIT but still wanted to have the exposure to this asset class. And at least one fund manager set up.
Next slide.
Oh, yeah, thank you. Thanks, Matt. A side-by-side investment vehicle where the main fund invested in long-short equities, and the side-by-side vehicle that the nonprofit went into invested in derivatives. They're called total return delta one swaps. A delta one swap is closely correlated to the underlying security. So as the security moved in the major fund, or the main fund, the derivative would move in the same direction. So the nonprofit would get the benefit of the movement and the exposure to that security without, and the main fund would employ leverage. The side-by-side fund did not need to employ leverage because it was using derivatives. Under the code, and I've just one site for this whole time, it's Treasury Reg section 1.512B1A little I. It's a section of the regs that permits nonprofits to receive return on notional principal contracts without that returns being considered UBTI. That's it for me, and I turn it over back to Matt.
Thanks. Moving to, I think that the takeaway there is that there may still yet be some creative tax work to do on managing UBTI and creative solutions, perhaps using notional principal contracts, which is very interesting. Another sort of novel case that we're going to move to on slide 43 is private foundations investing in partnerships. Sorry, back one more, yeah. So when private foundations invest in partnerships, they have a few different issues that come up. There are self-dealing issues, which I'm not going to go into too much today because hopefully there's going to be some guidance out any year now from the IRS on co-investing and self-dealing implications for private foundations and partnerships. And jeopardizing investments under 4944 is just rarely an enforcement or compliance issue. I think perhaps because everybody just complies with it so well. But excess business holdings issues do come up. And so while we're waiting for guidance on the self-dealing issue, the next slide shows a real life example in it where a technical advice memo looked at a situation where there was a founder, they called him a founder in the memo, who founded both a private foundation and also was called a co-owner, probably a partner of a venture capital firm sponsor. And the founder and the VC firm and the various family members were all disqualified persons. The venture capital sponsors had 8 different funds that it was managing. Perhaps on some guidance from lawyers, they set it up so that the foundation invested in 4 of those funds and the disqualified people invested in the 4 other funds. They were different funds, so they weren't, at least at the fund level, co-investing, but 7 of those 8 funds invested in overlapping portfolio companies. So while there was no co-investing at the fund level, there ultimately was co-investing at the portfolio company level, putting aside the self-dealing implications, the technical advice memo then recites all the lawyers that were involved, that the foundation had external lawyers and at least some internal legal counsel, and the fund sponsor had external counsel who was somewhat unusually engaged to consider a structure for the foundation and a principal investment of the firm. Well, it was on the next slide, although the foundation and disqualified people didn't invest in the same funds, they essentially had excess business holdings in the underlying portfolio companies. And just skipping to the next slide, the key lessons from this technical advice memo, which is worth reading in detail, is that excess business holding violations are not a theoretical risk. They are real, they happened in this case. And general compliance strategies that may seem reasonable, such as in this case, don't invest in the same fund, still may not work. The tech advice recites that correcting the excess business holdings was hindered because of the restrictions in the fund documents, but ultimately they cured it by donating the fund's interest to a public charity. There's also a big discussion about penalty abatements in it. On the next slide, lists some issues where private foundations can seek protection in fund terms, often in a side letter, because sometimes the private foundation provisions aren't included at all in the limited partnership agreement, or they're just some standard, very sponsor-friendly terms. So this is another point of negotiation to deal with some of these excess business holdings issues. And I think now we'll go to another unique situation of potentially investing in cryptocurrencies.
Thanks, Matt. So we'll just cover this very briefly, since cryptocurrencies have been in the news so much, and certainly a lot of investors of all types are thinking about them, but also including university foundations. Some have reportedly invested in Bitcoin, and I think various nonprofits. I know we get a lot of questions from our clients about investments in cryptocurrencies. Baker Hostetler has a large cryptocurrency blockchain group. I am a part of that group, and not only do we represent investors into cryptocurrency companies and cryptocurrency funds, we also do work for cryptocurrency companies themselves, so have deep expertise in this field and all the regulatory issues that go with it. So just a few points to note on cryptocurrencies, some of which you probably already are aware of. Of course, they're extremely risky investments, and as we've seen, especially last week, extremely volatile. Last week, and they seem to often move in unison. So last week, basically every cryptocurrency, or almost, had huge drops. The flip side is, historically, there have been potentially huge outsized returns. I think there's a debate as to whether that is going to be true for the future, but certainly in the past, I mean, the returns for certain cryptocurrencies and for a number of them have been much greater than normally what you could get in other types of assets. There are particular risks for cryptocurrencies, especially security risks and hacking, and there have been multiple problems with hacking and people or investors and companies losing their cryptocurrencies. So that's a heightened risk to be aware of. In general, they're currently unregulated, although there's a lot of discussion in Congress, certainly the SEC and the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. CFTC is discussing potentially more regulation. And the regulatory status of a lot of cryptocurrencies themselves can be uncertain as to whether or not they would be deemed to be securities. You should be aware that beyond Bitcoin, there are certainly numerous other cryptocurrencies out there that are traded on reputable exchanges, including in the US, and they do have uses other than just alternatives to the dollar or other fiat currencies. And there's also a lot of investments now in what's called DeFi, or decentralized finance, which is also extremely risky and complicated, but also has the potential for outsized returns. Let's go to the next slide. Just to finish up, so how do you invest in cryptocurrencies? You can invest directly. The easiest way is through a centralized cryptocurrency exchange, such as Coinbase US, but there are plenty of others. You can also invest into a fund that itself invests into cryptocurrencies, which are your normally open-end funds, similar to investing in a hedge fund, again, with maybe a much different risk profile than your average hedge fund. You can also make investments in cryptocurrency company startups. It's kind of same as investing in a private investment in a tech startup. And certainly also been a lot of news about environmental concerns about certain cryptocurrencies, especially Bitcoin, about how much energy it takes to mine that, and also environmental concerns about some other cryptocurrencies, including the second most well-known one, Ether and Ethereum, although there are supposed to be changes to how Ethereum works to lessen the environmental impact. Let's go to the next slide. So everyone should know that you need the second CLE code, which is nonprofit 02, NONPROFIT 02. So we just have a few minutes left, but we wanted to open it up to questions, which you can send over the chat.
Thanks very much. As we see if any questions come over the transom, I'll just take us home with our CLE reminder. So if you are applying for CLE credit, to obtain the CLE credit, you need to fill out the survey that will appear after the webinar ends. So stay tuned for that. Make sure to answer all of the questions and include your bar number and state of registration. As we previously mentioned, a recording of the webinar will be sent to all of the attendees, so you can revisit today's presentation at your leisure. And I would like to thank our panelists and thank you for joining us today. We hope you found this presentation to be informative, and we look forward to providing additional presentations in the future. So thank you all very much.